Ho ho ho, and what is up YouTube? My name is G3Iron and welcome as we begin our 2020 recap by first discussing the 3.9 Metamorph release that was taking place during the beginning of 2020. We're going to do a couple of things today as we take a trip down memory lane looking back at Metamorph. We're going to take a look back at Metamorph's brief history, a little bit about Reddit's reaction to Metamorph, some of the popular topics to discuss from earlier in the year, along with some of the statistics that we can track about player interaction, along with some personal anecdotes and some personal opinions regarding Metamorph as a league mechanic and as a part of the core Path of Exile gameplay. For those of you who are veterans of the channel, you know the way things work around here. All of the links to all of the different discussion points that we will be discussing today, including even some archived discussions from Reddit, will be included down below in the video description. If you're new around here, then you can of course like, subscribe, and ding the bell if you'd like to be notified about future videos just like this one. Without any further ado, let the revisionism begin and let's take a look back at Metamorph.
Take a clean knife and cut a sample of flesh. Repeat 4 times. Mix the 5 samples in an aquaformatic solution. Heat.
The story of Metamorph begins with ExileCon, where we first learned about Metamorph as an expansion, along with a whole slew of additional information about the future and the vision and the ambition of the team at Grinding Gear Games, putting together the future of Path of Exile. Amongst other announcements, including Path of Exile 2 or 4.0, depending on whichever language you want to use, along with a PoE mobile game, also was announced Metamorph League that would be coming during the end of 2019 and would wrap up throughout the beginning portions, the first quarter of 2020. Metamorph itself was officially playable on PC December 13th in 2019, and it came as a league alongside a major endgame Atlas expansion known as the Conquerors of the Atlas. We're not going to talk about Conquerors of the Atlas today. We'll save that for another revisionist review discussion. We're just going to focus our discussion today on Metamorph. The numbers that you can see from the statistics above my slightly festive forehead are, of course, from a website called Steamcharts. It's a wonderful spot where you can go and check Steam iterations and Steam statistics of players playing specific games using Steam as a client for that particular game. Path of Exile notably has got a standalone client, meaning that all of the data that could be used to get a real clear picture on what exactly the Path of Exile player base looks like, well, we simply don't have access to all of that. We only have access to the Steam information. We don't have access to the standalone information. That being said, with the information that we do have, you can see in the highlighted red box, that is going to be the cycle for Metamorph when it started in December of 2019, carried on through January and February of 2020. I'm not going to count March, even though it lasted a little bit into March, because March was when the announcement and the hype train really was being built up for Delirium, and we'll chat about that again on another video. Just a quick note of comparison here as you're looking at the Steam chart numbers. Yes, Metamorph has got a relatively high amount of players who are playing it with a peak player count of 117,000 players that were playing on the Steam client for Path of Exile for Metamorph. And that is larger than Blight's launch in September, and it's larger than the Legion launch in June. The couple of caveats just to remember is, again, Metamorph comes alongside the release of a major endgame change and a major endgame expansion. So just remember that with a grain of salt as you're looking back at Metamorph to say whether or not it was a success or not. It got released at the same time an endgame expansion did. And so as player totals shifted and as player totals have grown over the course of a year, if you really want to do a one-to-one comparison, it's really, really tough to do. I see a lot of players on Reddit and on the forums and on our Discord and even on YouTube discussions as well referencing Steam charts. And the reality is that data, unless you're comparing it in a one-to-one vacuum, it really is tough not to get your numbers and not to get your conclusions then garbled up, because what you're putting into your algorithm to potentially give you an output isn't necessarily always the same. So just keep that in mind. You can look at Steam charts and they are quite helpful, and we're going to do that in our 2020 reviews, but just take it with a grain of salt. Realize that it's not comparing at a one-to-one ratio, and it's not the whole picture. It's not players who play on the standalone client, of which I am one of them. Well, Reddit had a lot of thoughts about Metamorph, and I used a simple search program. Of course, all of this is linked down below, so that way you can go back and take a look at a couple of the more popular posts that took place during the life cycle of Metamorph. One of the most popular posts is, of course, a meme featuring the Necromancer Ascendancy, conversely juxtaposed with the Deadeye Pathfinder and Raider Ascendancies, simply saying, "Nice Bow League grinding gear games." Yes, ladies and gentlemen, if you're new to Path of Exile in 2020, Metamorph was the birth, it was the genesis of the Bow League sort of meme that has now become commonplace in most discussions about Path of Exile and any character that is coming off of the Ranger tree. Metamorph originally included a rework for several different unique bows and several different bow skills, and so a lot of players thought at the time, myself included, hey, a bow rework, that's great, that means a buff, right? Well, no, it didn't mean that, and in fact, we have never seen any of the Ranger Ascendancies recover to their previous level of popularity since the bow rework. Things have just gone downhill in terms of a bow configuration. Nowadays in Path of Exile, if you're using a bow, you're probably actually a spellcaster, and you're using the bow to push a couple extra gem levels into whatever spell it is that you're using. I think in 2020, probably the most popular bow build was ED Contagion, but there's a couple out there as well, like Toxic Rain and Caustic Arrow. But you get the picture. Basically, most folks were using bows as a way to pump jump levels up rather than using bows in order to build attack-based characters that would go really fast off of the Ranger tree. Some other memes that Reddit came up with was, of course, having the hope to play a melee build and maybe branch out from that melee build and go do spellcasting or something else, but then eventually reset her on melee. And melee has been a discussion point in Path of Exile since Path of Exile has been Path of Exile. It's always a discussion point. There is always a segment of the population who is discussing melee and where melee is at, both in the meta as well as in the design space, in terms of what the designers at Grinding Gear Games are thinking and hoping for melee. And Metamorph was another one of those leagues where players were, of course, crying and confused about what exactly melee was supposed to be in comparison with ranged attacks, ranged spells, minions, and other sorts of archetypes like totems and mines and trappers. There was also, of course, the big controversy about monster HP, that there were some buffs that were coming to monster HP to make the game a little bit more difficult with Metamorph, and a lot of players freaked out. Now, Grinding Gear Games originally conveyed through various announcements that the idea behind making monsters a little bit tankier was to eventually give us more player power. Of course, for those of us who played more than just Metamorph and eventually played Delirium, we got a ton of player power throughout the 2020 year. I'm getting a little bit ahead of myself, but at the time, that was a big discussion point about monster health, boss health, and difficulty across the game in general. And last but not least, our fourth picture that is above my slightly festive and jolly forehead is, of course, a suggestion, a UI suggestion for coming up with a trade screen that would allow you to trade with an NPC in somebody's hideout rather than forcing someone to come out of a map or come out of a lab or come out of the mines, etc. Stop what they're doing in order to trade with you. Yes, people for a long time have hated the way how trade exists in Path of Exile. People for a long time have come up with several alternative ideas, and Grinding Gear Games is very committed to the way how they want to do trade. So if you think you've got new ideas on how GGG can do a trade or auction house sort of thing and make it fly, well, I've got bad news for you. Somebody else has probably already thought of it, suggested it, and been rejected soundly multiple times over the course of multiple leagues. When it comes to my own personal thoughts on Metamorph, I've got a couple of them. I feel a little bit like our buddy Harold up here. I'm definitely going to say that Metamorph on its own, as a league divorced or removed from, abstractly pulled out of the expansion that was Conqueror of the Atlas, I thought it deserved at least a thumbs up, at least one thumbs up, but it's somewhat of a tentative thumbs up, and part of the reason for that is, of course, if Metamorph was released on its own without the Conquerors of the Atlas expansion, I don't think it would have been that well received. I think it would have been one of the lower total player counts that would have interacted with the league in and of itself. I thought that Metamorph was great in that it added a reason to kill bosses, but at the same time there was something lacking from that. It felt like it was missing something, like maybe there was supposed to be an uber boss at the end, something like a Katarina fight that we built up to, something like maybe a Delve All fight that we built up to, something like, I don't know, even like the delirium encounters that we experience with the simulacrum. There was something that was just a little bit off with delirium, and it felt like maybe they just ran out of time at grinding gear games, and so they gave us what we now have in Metamorph, and that was enjoyable, and I do enjoy it. But it felt like there was some end game part of it that was missing. Maybe there was some kind of uber Frankenstein monster that we were supposed to assemble, or maybe Tane was supposed to stab us in the back after we had done enough research for him, and maybe we were supposed to fight Tane himself. I don't know, but there was definitely something there that felt like was missing at the end of the Metamorph interactions and Metamorph quest line. I've already mentioned it for the sake of discussion today, but it is a point that needs to be reiterated, and it certainly impacted me personally. Like, boss balancing and the monster HP, I was fine with it. Make the game harder. I think that's completely fine. Path of Exile is nowhere near as difficult as something like Dark Souls 3, which I tried to play this year, and that was just an utter failure. So Path of Exile, in terms of adding difficulty, is fine, right? We can gear check our way past a lot of things, and I've realized over the last year that that's one of the things that I like about Path of Exile. If there's content that's too difficult for you, you can probably gear check your way past it at some point. You can continue to grind, you can continue to trade, you can continue to improve your gear and improve your character to be able to get past something that was previously unpassable for your build and for your play. There are some things that, of course, are going to be rewarded through skill in play, and you won't need the gear in order to gear check it. But for me, I thought that adding monster difficulty was something that would be healthy for the game. It might even slow the game down. But that didn't slow the game down nearly as much as what the bow rework did. I've got to mention it again just because bows are a mythological archetype. They're a historical archetype. Players come and play Path of Exile because they want to play a character who plays and uses a bow. That is a massive archetype in fantasy as well as in historical realism sorts of games. And the fact that bows are in the spot that they're in after the bow rework does not leave me with much hope moving forward. And I really only see a couple of things changing the way how bows get used in the future. That being said, slight teaser for 3.13, I am planning on playing a bow build. I'm about 99% sure of the build that I'm going to play. But as always, I've got to wait and see what patch notes do to that particular build before I lock it in and recommend it to you all. So to sum up my personal opinion about Metamorph, I'm kind of like Harold. Thumbs up, and it could have been better, but it also could have been worse. I'm glad it's a part of the core gameplay experience in Path of Exile now, and I would rate it as a healthy but not necessarily special league mechanic. Well, thanks so much, everybody, for joining us for today's discussion and our recap of Metamorph. What were your thoughts on Metamorph as a league? Did you have any particular impressions or particular passions about that league? Did anything happen to you during that league or for you during that league that really sticks out and is a joyful memory or maybe even a painful memory that you'd like to share with the community down below? Also, how do you interact with Metamorph today now that it's a part of the core gameplay Path of Exile experience? Drop us a comment down below. I'd love to read it and interact with your thoughts and your memories from Metamorph League. Thanks once again for watching, and I hope the upcoming 3.13 League is the league where a Mirror of Calandra drops for you.
Thanks for watching that video. If you'd like more information on any of our discussion points today, you can see them down below in the video description. If you'd also like to join our Discord or support our Patreon, you can do so with the links down below. Thanks again, and big shout out to all of our Patreon supporters.